Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Hotels and Hospitality Focus webinar. This is our 7th webinar in our COVID-19 Impact on African Real Estate series. Last week, we focused on the adoption of PropTech in the real estate sector. And this week, we'll be focusing on the hotels and hospitality sector, which many view as one sector that is going to be severely impacted by the current pandemic. So during the session, we'll look at how investors, operators, developers, and the whole industry are adapting to the current situation, as well as getting their perspectives on how the sector will emerge post-COVID-19. We are very fortunate today to have an excellent panel with us from across the globe. So I'd also now like to take the opportunity to introduce them. So we have moderating and setting the scene for the discussion is Wayne Godwin, Head of Hotel Advisory, JLL's Hotels and Hospitality Group. And our panel for today are Mossadegh Bali, Founder and CEO of Azalai Group, Laurie Kruger, Chief Investment Officer, MIA RF Capital, Owen Garnier, Senior Director Development, Radisson Hotel Group, and Gillian Saunders, Independent Hospitality and Tourism Advisor. Thank you all. Thank you to all the panelists for your time today and for providing insights. I would also like to take this time to thank our headline sponsor for the series, Standard Bank, and our series sponsor, Nedbank, for allowing us to put on these sessions throughout March and May. For our audience, we encourage you to ask questions to the panelists throughout the session. We'll do our utmost best to answer as many of them as we can. We'll also be running interactive polls throughout the session, so please interact with those as we go along. I would like now to hand over to Wayne, who will start off with giving a brief presentation, setting the scene, and then we'll dive into the panel discussion from there. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Kafir. That's great. And I think whilst I welcome everyone and thank you for joining us, it is really great to have the panel that we have. I think quite a nice cross section of views, with myself and Gillian sitting on the sidelines acting as advisors. We've got Mossadegh as an owner operator, Laurie as an active investor in this space, and Owen really giving us his view more from an operator perspective. So I think a really great cross-section of views, and that's really good for that substantive discussion that we can have. However, if you're looking to us for a view on the future and when the recovery is going to happen, really the crystal ball at the moment is pretty murky. So we're going to do our best. I think from a JLL perspective, we facilitate around $1.2 billion in capital transactions every day. So we are seeing the way capital is behaving through the pandemic and how the recovery is shaping up across the globe. Now, I think from a Sub-Saharan Africa point of view, as many geographies across the world, the pandemic is ultimately going to determine the recovery. And that's really what we need to focus on. More so than any other sector, the crisis really cuts at the heart of our sector, the people. So really we have to balance the reopening of our hotels and in the best interests of staff and employees and our guests, and also the livelihoods that many support. And that's really where we want to center the discussion today around these kind of critical topics. So I've got a few slides that I'd like to take you through just to set the scene, and then we'll jump into the discussion with our panelists. So the first slide really, I guess, puts a lot of this into context around how global it is and the extent, how does this crisis shape up compared to other crises that we've seen before. So you can see the latest sort of forecasts are that travel and tourism, or tourism arrivals, will be down by 20 to 30% for 2020, which is significantly more than any previous crisis that we've seen. So you go back to the global financial crisis and you can see it's pretty small in magnitude. So this really kind of paints the extent to which the crisis is the magnitude of it. And ultimately, this is the lifeblood that we require from a hotel sector is people traveling. Then the next slide goes into performance, and I think at this time it's it's interesting to look at performance of hotels, but ultimately we know just how poor the sector is performing. We know what the challenges are. The focus really has to shift to recovery. So just the slide kind of puts it in context, though, is just how big the effect has been. So year to date, March, every little circle represents effectively a hotel market that as JLL we track around the world, with the blue line effectively being same period last year. So you can see really the extent to which occupancy has come under pressure across the globe. The next slide, really just puts this in context of Sub-Saharan Africa. You can see the blue and the green lines showing January and February occupancy. Generally pretty flat, with a few notable stronger performances in the first 2 months, but really that's when the crisis hit, March, and we can see the extent to which performance has come under pressure, and we're likely to see this drop even further. Of course, this is only really hotels that are open, so many of the hotels have closed their doors and they're not even measured in this metric. So it gives you some context in terms of the effect, but ultimately it's a pretty blurry picture because you have to kind of understand how many hotels have closed their doors, etc. Then this slide, I really just wanted to kind of set the context, and apologies that it's come across a little bit small, but your one axis being the number of hotel rooms, and the other axis showing the number of COVID cases that have been reported in each particular market. And I've only shown South Africa here, just to really show you how much bigger a hotel market South Africa is relative to the other markets on the continent. And to look at this graph really in context, at the moment, so much of the pressure and the shutdown has been policy related. So governments imposing travel bans, etc., where this graph is going to become more relevant as case numbers grow and policy starts easing, and consumers and travelers are making decisions around whether they travel based on their own comfort of traveling to a particular market or country. So right now, case numbers is not necessarily reflective of conditions in the hospitality sector, but we do believe it will increasingly become. So if I just take out South Africa, you sort of see a bit of a clearer view on what the rest of the market's doing. You can see the other graph just showing the number of closures. So across the board, Cape Town, about 89% of hotel rooms closed. Nairobi, 58%. Lagos, 45%. Addis Ababa, only 10% at this time. Now, this is only a sample of hotels that report performance, but still gives you a picture that a lot of hotels are closing, either by law or at their own discretion. If we take a step back from COVID, and I think it's important that we not kind of get too caught up in what the last 2 months has really meant for us, we need to kind of keep in context where the Sub-Saharan Africa hotel market is more generally. And in that sense, I like to kind of just draw a few references, and you can see if we put GDP on the other axis, relative to hotel size of the industry, we still see obviously South Africa way ahead, but pretty much on par with Nigeria from a GDP perspective. And this really kind of speaks to a lot of what the fundamentals of development in Africa are, and the opportunities is it's not so much the extent of economic activity. It's the type of economic activity. And really the big opportunity in Africa going forward is the transition of economies to more secondary and tertiary sectors versus just their primary sector. So if we were to draw another reference and compare Sub-Saharan Africa to France, Sub-Saharan Africa only has about 40% of the room supply of France. When I hear that, I hear opportunity, and I think that's the message to kind of put across, is we are very much in the formative stages of evolution and growth from a capital market and from a sector point of view in Africa, and that is ultimately why we think there's opportunity there. So also, if we were to look and say 158 tourist arrivals per room in Sub-Saharan Africa, in France this would only be 139. Sub-Saharan Africa has a GDP of $7.2 million per key versus only $4.2 million per key in France. This delta is really what we're saying the opportunity essentially is, that transition of economies, and that's where we see a lot of opportunity for hotel markets to emerge within the growth story of Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's more in the corporate type business hotels. Of course, we appreciate that there's a very big opportunity from a leisure perspective that's not often necessarily correlated with GDP growth, etc. But I think it just really is intended to set the scene that Africa, if we take a step back and look at the longer term fundamentals, are still exceptionally good. Culturally, we're still people that like to travel and meet with people and do business face to face, and that I don't think is going to change anytime soon. So I think while most of the focus of today's discussion will be on the impact of COVID, let's of course keep perspective on the bigger picture as well. Right, and then just, I think whilst a lot of the policy that has been a bit disruptive from a travel and tourism sector from governments has been really with the right intentions from a public health perspective, but I think it does beg the question as an industry where we do need to be asking questions about doing the easy things, the things that are not right now public health issues, so real barriers to the sector that over we've all lobbied for and been critical and noted, but now's the time really where that voice has to be more amplified, and governments can do a lot more in our view to promote travel and tourism, because the main challenge really is the cost around travel in Africa. I mean, many of you listening today will be well aware of this and just how inhibitive that really is. So it's little things like open sky policies will make a very big difference. We're too protectionist around our airlines, and really that's a topic for a completely separate webinar in itself. Visas are still very difficult and cumbersome to get across Africa. Destination marketing is still really in its infancy, but starting to gain a bit of ground. You see Visit Rwanda, Arsenal deal, the year of the return in Ghana last year being incredibly successful. But these are things where we need to start reprioritizing the sector and pumping money into our national airlines as a source of pride. You get a far better investment by moving that money elsewhere. We've also encouraged a lot of hotel investment, but haven't necessarily built infrastructure around hotel schools, etc., and training programs. But a positive, I guess, was on the airport infrastructure, which has improved significantly in the last 5 years in Africa, which essentially shows that we often can do the difficult things, but it's the easier things around policy that often cause more of a challenge. Right, and I guess why this matters, and mostly around in a COVID environment, is because tourism and hospitality is a large employer of people. I've taken just a few data points from different sources and different different sources. So I can't speak to necessarily them being 100% aligned in terms of methodology and how these are tracked. But broadly speaking, you can see that hotels and hospitality employ a lot of people in Africa. And really, it's in context of those last two, the bottom two graphs, that this is most important. I mean, this is just a survey from the Genesis Analytics survey that was used in the risk-adjusted strategy for South Africa, and you can see just how dire the expectation is around tourism from an employment point of view. So only 5% of employees expected to be paid by the end of May in South Africa in the tourism sector. Whereas if we look at a longer term, 55% expecting to be retrenched essentially. And these are scary numbers. And I think a lot remains to be seen, but I think it does, it's incumbent on all of us to make this the focus, and the recovery is essential to that. Just in terms of new developments, obviously a lot of the development activity in Sub-Saharan Africa remains very development focused. A lot of questions for developers, around timelines, construction delays, how are the tenants, developers, funders all going to be managing the extent of the crisis that we're seeing? Are there alternative use cases for developers looking to still open this year? Funders are completely relooking how they appraise real estate and hotels in particular, given its operational nature. And these are really a lot of questions that I guess the sector's grappling with, whether it's owners of real estate today or whether it's still developers. And I think hopefully we can discuss it a bit more through the panel. Now, as I said, the crystal ball is very murky in terms of timeline, and I think ultimately, like I said, that the pandemic is going to dictate the timeline around when recovery starts to happen. But I think thematically we can sort of hypothesize around what is sort of an order of events could look like. And I think right now we're still in that policy-induced slowdown. We're going to move into that pandemic high-risk period where people are allowed to travel, but essentially are very cautious and probably are deferring anything that is not absolutely non-discretionary. Post that, when we start hitting our peak numbers across Sub-Saharan Africa, that's when we really will start to see a recovery. First, probably with government aid and NGO, should be a little bit of a quicker recovery. Domestic corporate recovery should also be quite early, particularly and really moving from more non-discretionary to discretionary travel. And then we should see the domestic leisure travel. I mean, we've all been stuck in our homes for months. We're all going to be very excited to take that domestic break and long weekend and make the most of that. So we'll see that recovering in intermittent phases as holiday periods we reach holiday periods. International leisure should be a longer recovery. We definitely think that will be one of the most protracted recovery periods. The MICE segment, I think, will probably be the last segment to recover. So that's your meetings and incentives, conferences, but should be quite quick once it does. I don't think we've fundamentally changed our approach to how we want to be doing conferences and meetings, etc. So just a few conclusions. I think at the moment we're not seeing much activity in terms of investment activity, at least. A lot of watching and waiting. I think there is a lot of capital and dry powder on the sidelines looking opportunistically at the sector, which is a good thing. I think lots going to happen in Q2 or in second half of this year and into next year around distressed assets. A lot of development is slowing from a technical and construction perspective, but development activity remains and appetite at least remains pretty strong across the board. But with each month brings a different view from owners and lenders, and of course we just have to watch this very closely. So I think that's enough from my side formally, and I'd like to invite my panelists in at this point, and move the discussion to them. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Mossadegh, maybe just for you to invite you into the discussion. From an Azalea Hotel Group, how are you adapting to the crisis, and what are the things you're doing, and what are you seeing?
Thanks. Well, first of all, let me thank you for having me on this webinar. Happy to meet some good old friends whom I haven't met lately. Well, as you said, our industry is badly hit by this pandemic. What we have done in Azalea Hotel Group was to have a daily crisis meeting to assess the situation, and we started to close the hotels one after another. Once we didn't have any more customers in the hotels, so I think the first hotels we closed were in Bamako first, and then Abidjan, Cotonou, Nouakchott, and Guinea-Bissau. Some of the hotels reopened a week later or 10 days later, because the governments wanted to have a hotel to quarantine some travelers, but these hotels are closed again. We have just one hotel in Bamako which is still open, which has been rented by the European Union, where we host the Malian Army training mission. Unfortunately, we of course had to furlough close to 80% of our associates, and you know how difficult it is for us as leaders to furlough our associates, especially due to the fact that on the continent, I would say almost all the African continents don't have unemployment packages. So we managed to pay. We managed to pay the month of March. I saw your slide saying that 55% in South Africa will not get paid by May. We managed to pay the packages for March, even though we did not work the full months. But unfortunately, for April and May, our associates will remain without any revenue. So this, for me, big challenge also for the governments post-pandemic. Maybe Africa as a continent, African continents should start thinking about unemployment benefits like we have in some developed countries, because we can see that on the human side, it's very difficult to have people without any revenues. Of course, we maintain some limited staff to maintain the hotels for security reasons also. So we have limited staff in the hotels. And at the corporate level, we are working very hard on marketing, on communication, on sanitary measures to get ready when business start picking up.
Good. Okay, Laurie, I mean, you know, you've been around for a while looking at Sub-Saharan Africa. How does this crisis rank, you know, relative to some of the others, and what are some of the learnings that we've seen in the past that we can be using now?
Yeah, thanks, man. I think, look, I'm starting to severely dislike the word unprecedented, but at least since I've been looking at the African market, or in recent history, we've never had the number of hotel closures across the entire continent as we are facing today, right? So in that sense, the situation is unique, and I expect the impact to be severely unique. That being said, having gone through the financial crisis on the continent, with life projects ongoing, having funding issues, having equity issues, having gone through, the East African security situation where we were massively invested in that part of the world, having gone through Ebola in West Africa and its impact on travel and tourism throughout the continent. Tourism and travel, and specifically hotels, are massively exposed to these external shocks. The flip side of that is the industry and the sector bounces back, right? And it sometimes bounces back faster than some of the others. You've got some very resourceful people and some battle-hardened people working in this sector that have learned a lot of lessons that maybe some of the people in the developed world are only learning now for the first time. And I think that'll stand us in good stead. So yes, this is going to be severe. Yes, there's been a lot of pain, and I suspect that we're in for a little bit of pain yet. But I also think that the industry and the sector will bounce back relatively quickly.
Good. Yeah. And Erwin, from a Radisson Hotel Group point of view, in terms of the hotels that you have on the continent, I mean, what are some of the things you're doing to, I guess, prepare to operate safely at some point?
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you for inviting me on behalf of Radisson Hotel Group. So, as you know, it's a global crisis touching half of the world population, and the first industry being impacted is tourism and hospitality. So, as an international operator, the priority number one is obviously safety and security, both for the customers and for your team members. So as Laurie mentioned earlier, a lot of hotels have been shut down, and other hotels are still operating or reopening, depending on the local regulation and the government decision. For Radisson Hotel Group, we just implemented a global safety protocol in order to ensure that we have optimized safety towards COVID-19 for the entire guests that are going to be staying in our hotel, and for the team members that are spending there, that are delivering service for the customers. So what we did is we partnered with SGS, which is one of the largest hygiene experts, and we work with the World Travel and Tourism Council, the WTTC, in order to create a protocol that, in fact, WTTC announced earlier this week to create some kind of global protocol for travel and tourism that would allow a customer to have a sense of security regardless of the place they travel in. Whether it's in Cape Town, Bamako, you will have a base of security and of hygiene for the customer to understand if they're safe or not safe in the place they decide to stay in. So this protocol is being implemented in every single hotel we have worldwide, and I'm talking about almost 1,500 hotels. And obviously, it definitely includes Africa. So it's going to touch a lot of operational points, from implementing social distancing or ensuring that there is screening at the front desk, or having hygiene being used by the customers at arrival, at departure, at touch points, and obviously masking, gloves for the team. So it's a new experience, and it's a new norm that is going to be implemented in most of hotels that are being branded by Radisson, and I'm sure by other branded operators.
Okay, yeah, good. And Gillian, from your side, I guess, what are some of the broader impacts to the travel sector, not so much just the hotel sector that you're seeing across the world and across the region?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne, and thanks also for having me on the panel today. And maybe just echo a couple of things to start with. I also think tourism is going to be resilient and it's going to come back, but I do think it's going to be slow and we may have to be different in some ways. And I think on the African continent in particular, and it goes to who we will be as a tourism industry into the future, we need to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to have a very, very, very sustainable industry on all the measures, and it's going to be vitally important. But there's so many ways to look at this. Wayne, I think actually your data, the UNWTO came out with new scenarios for how tourism might recover only this week. And they had 3 scenarios. One was that we would, from 2020, would be down 58%. This is the good scenario. 58% decrease in international tourism. If we see substantial easing coming back from July onwards. If it only starts to come back in September, 70% down. If it only starts to come back in December, basically nearly 80% down, 78% down. And Africa's going to be possibly even worse, because I think we're behind the curve in terms of where we are with the pandemic. So countries are getting out of it a little bit and easing off a bit.
Yeah.
How will we be able to come back? I think governments will decide to some extent where people can fly. We already spoke about the protocols, and we need to have products, and it's not just the hotels, it's the airlines, it's the transport operators, it will later be the safari operators, etc. We'll have to have the hygiene and safety and sanitization protocols. I think our tourists are going to look much more strongly at, do we have hospital beds in case they're taken sick while they're here? And that might be a challenge on the African continent. And this is probably slightly more the leisure tourist than the foreign tour than the business tourist. We're going to have to even look at things like immunity passports people have talked about, and health checks before you allow a person to come into your establishment, that sort of thing. And health insurance is going to be a big thing. But the one I want to maybe touch on a bit that's going to drive a lot of travel and tourism within our continent and in and out of our continent is whether the airlift will be there and what will airlift be like, because we need aviation. And we already knew we had a challenge with aviation on the continent. IATA has also produced some stats where they say if you actually look at some of the theories of social distancing on airplanes, which is like empty seats, airfares will have to go up between 43 and 54%. So, there's a nice thing for the airlines that fuel costs have gone down. But we already had a challenged airline and airlift industry. So that's going to be one of the big things. How will the airlines survive? And in fact, that's the next thing when we hear everybody talk about the hotel closures, is if this does endure for longer, much of the supply will be decimated. And how, will businesses survive? Will businesses actually go totally to the wall? And will there be enough supply to take up the recovery when the recovery happens? And I think that's going to be one of our challenges. And when we look at our African continent governments, we don't have the fiscal depths of the US and the UK and France and Germany to support the industry. I don't know if you all came across this IATA with UNWTO, WTTC, and the 2 African airline associations, the African Airline Association and the Southern African Airline Association. Actually, we've gone directly to some of the multilateral aid agencies and said, we need to help this industry, tourism. And they're talking about the broader tourism industry. It's your hotels in the city centers, it's the safari lodges, it's the beach resorts, it's the, let's cut your year of return in Ghana, everything to try and get support. Because as they say, we have 25 million jobs on this continent are dependent on tourism directly. And that's a lot of people. We also have a huge conservation industry, private and public on the continent, that is totally dependent on tourism. And the tourism entry fees and the businesses that survive on those reserves also need the travel and tourism. And without it, those communities, those people lose their livelihoods, but we also lose our ability to keep the flora and fauna. We don't have the anti-poaching teams anymore. We don't have the rangers anymore. We can't maintain the fences anymore. So we're in danger of losing this massively important asset for the leisure side of our tourism industry as well. So there's a lot of dynamics, particularly for our continent, to this disease and the steps that people have taken to sort of contain it. Yeah.
No, exactly. And I think that's really where a lot of the concern is. Mossadegh, and from your perspective, looking at, I guess, past challenges and past crises that you've seen, how does this rank, and what, I guess, what were some of the lessons that you learned at that stage that have been important to your clear recovery, that can be adopted across the continent at this point?
Well, I totally agree with the recovery plan you mentioned in your slides. I think domestic demand will pick up first. So one takeaways is maybe we should insist much more on domestic business. We tend to emphasize on international travelers, and we all know, at least at Azalai, we know that 70% of our revenues come from intra-Africa travelers and the intra-Africa miles. So maybe we should focus on that. As said, the air traffic is already very expensive. I think it's the most expensive one on earth. And how will the airlines now cost a seat on an airplane, since they will have to let go, I think, 1 out of 2 seats, if I'm not mistaken. So that will make traveling more costly in Africa. So for me, that will be a big challenge. That's why I think the years should really focus on domestic demand, MICE, meetings, NGOs, government demand, business travelers, African business travelers. So for me, that will be priority. Of course, all the new measures that Aaron mentioned, we are also working on that. I saw the one which were adapted by the American Hotel Association. So we have many protocols now coming out. So we are going to benchmark all these protocols. And as a matter of fact, we are now using webinars to train our loft associates who are staying home doing nothing. So we are training them right now on all these new protocols, so that when the hotels reopen, they will be ready to greet the customers. Of course, we will need also to educate the customers on all these new measures. I remember Azalai has hotels in the Sahel zone, which is also a zone which has gone through a lot of problems, like security problems. When we had all these new security measures, like X-rays and reinforced security measures, we had some kind of resistance from the customers. Some felt that they are not in a hotel, but in a military compound. So we really had to educate them. Today, I mean, if you don't have all these security measures, at least in the Sahel, you will not get customers in your hotels. So I would think that we will have to go through also that educational process to tell the customers why you should use all these measures, because your security is our #1 concern. So we'll have to go through that. And thirdly, maybe we'll have to store some investments, so that to consolidate what exists already and store some investment. For me, I wouldn't see a pickup in new investment before 2021 or 2022.
Yeah. Okay. No, and I think I like what you say around the domestic market recovery, and I think that's been something that we've been seeing anyway. I mean, I think so much of the potential from a hospitality point of view in Africa is in that interregional travel. It's the domestic and regional business travel, and a lot of that is concentrated in your more mid-scale segments, and that's frankly the segment we're seeing already recovering in China. So I think that bodes well from an opportunity point of view. I think as we kind of move up that quality scale and we rely more on international travel, that's really where the slower recovery is probably going to be felt if you take across the board picture. Laurie, I mean, I think from an investor point of view, a lot of the attention right now and what we're seeing and the discussions that are being had are at a banking and lender level. I mean, what do you think are some of the things that banks need to be looking at or owners need to be pushing for, and that can ultimately is going to be quite important to overall sustainability?
Yeah, look, I mean, 100%. I think the banks are in as bad a position as the equity holders here, right? And you've got to, I spent a lot of time in the bank, and people sometimes give the banks it's an easy game to give the banks a bollocking, right, and a kicking. But look, these guys have committed money next to the equity holders. No bank is in the business of taking back real estate, especially hotels. Most banks would quite happily admit that they don't fully understand all the intricacies of hospitality, and would, that would be an absolute last course of action that they would take. That being said, banks are going to look at this, and everybody's coming at from a point of uncertainty. So, if you're looking at trading assets today, a lot of countries and a lot of hotel owners went into COVID with quite stretched balance sheets, right? So if you're looking at occupancies across the continent down between 70 and 90%, and projected RevPARs at around minus 60% for the year, it's the same issue that equity owners are going to face as what banks are going to face is what do we do, right? How do we save this? And there's going to be a lot of kicking the can down the road. And the old adage that was coined in the financial crisis, that a rolling loan gathers no loss, is going to come back in fashion. But ultimately, I think the banks are going to be forced to accept this kind of delay tactics, because the reality for them is they're either going to book a massive loss when they try to take back these things, or they're going to sit with an asset that they don't really want and can't do anything in the secondary market with. That being said, I do think we're going to see foreclosures at some point. It won't happen now. The conversations are ongoing with the banks. I think there's debt relief, or at least debt service relief. If you're capitalizing interest, that's going to buy you some time. And if we take the view that this market is going to come back Q4, Q1, Q2 next year, you need to do the analysis and see whether the additional burden that you're going to put on yourself and on your business and on that hotel through capitalizing interest and expenses is going to be worth it over the long run. So I do think we're going to see foreclosures. That's something outside of South Africa, in Africa at least, that we haven't seen a whole lot of, right? So that by itself is going to create a market that's going to be interesting. And I think, back to the investment piece as a whole, there are people with quite substantial amounts of dry powder who were looking to invest in the sector prior to COVID. So I know for a fact that a lot of people, or a lot of these players, are right now sitting back and saying, well, you know what, let's see how this plays out. There's obviously there's not a lot of clarity on valuation right now. That'll improve over time. But I think, the positive for me here is that once we start seeing this distressed asset recycling coming from the banking side, that's in a lot of countries around the continent, that'll be a whole new market that gets created out of COVID, which is immensely positive.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunistic capital. And we're seeing it in Europe and across the globe already. A lot of the private equity is already not even waiting for the distressed assets to come to market. They're moving straight in with in the distress space in the debt side with mezz loans, etc. Not even necessarily waiting. So like you say, I mean, really, we're so late stage in the cycle, and there's this hunt for yield, and hotels are still incredibly attractive, and a lot of dry powder. So I think globally, that's certainly something we're going to see. I think in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's definitely going to be quite different by market, owner type. But yeah, it's definitely one to watch. And I think certainly the discussions with a lot of banks that we're having is that there's no distressed assets at the moment. But come the second half of the year, we certainly expect this to start coming to fruition. Erwin, from your side, from an operator point of view, I mean, what does this all mean in terms of, I mean, we've seen this consolidation of operators kind of globally. I mean, do you expect to see a further consolidation? And I guess, what does this really mean for investors in the segment, in the sector?
We all have a lack of clarity, and it includes vision on for investors taking over groups right now. I think right now it's all about survival, adapting, overcoming, and surviving. I think this is a short term. On the long term, there will be a wave, I personally think, on acquisitions based on foreclosures. But for now, I think that the main goal of the operator is to sustain the business we have by ensuring that the current hotels that are being operated are secure. And I think this is the biggest focus for us right now as an operator, is making sure that the customers that are going to be coming back are going to be secure, and thus the business will restart slowly to grow, and keeping the growth of the group on the long run. So Radisson Hotel Group is still committed 100% to grow in Africa, as we've been for the last 20 years. And the dynamic of the challenge, even though it's a unique situation, the dynamic of the challenge related to, for example, funding, as well as was discussing Laurie earlier, has always been a challenge of the continent. It's becoming even much more a challenge right now. But funding for hotel development has been the number one key challenge for any hotel operator. And it will be even more of a challenge. So the opportunity for an hotel operator right now is taking over conversions. Hotels that are being unbranded are potentially owners are going to be interested to brand those hotel properties. For one reason, customers are going to be looking for safety. A brand shows some security, and this will provide the customer a sense of security, and owners are going to be looking to increase their market share. To increase their market share, they're going to need brands like Radisson. So I think there is also an opportunity for takeover during this period. In fact, we are currently seeing this happening right now. Now, on the other side, if you're looking at the growth of new hotels, it's going to be obviously more challenging for a simple reason that for more long-term investment is higher. And obviously, banks and equity funders are more reluctant because the industry right now is seen as risky, to say the least. And it's normal. The tourism and hospitality industry is the number one being impacted. And you've seen on your slide how strong it is depending on the market. So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. There is some market that obviously are going to recover quicker, and business is going to come back faster. For South Africa, unfortunately, because of the lockdown, that is one of the toughest in the continent, if not in the world, it's definitely going to be slower. But there will be also opportunities during this difficult time.
Yeah, and Gillian, from your side, in terms of governments and balancing that act of trying to reopen versus, obviously trying to first and foremost look after the public health of the countries. What do you think some of the things that governments can be doing at this stage to support the hotel sector and employment within it? And realistically, I mean, you touched on the fiscal position that it's not really there in terms of a buffer, but what can really be done, I guess, is the question.
I think governments have to, first of all, be open to talking to the industry. And I think on the African continent, in many countries, we don't really go as an industry to government very, very effectively. In South Africa, reasonably effectively, we do that. We have an apex industry body, the Tourism Business Council. But, governments take their stance, and the South African government's taken this incredibly strong lockdown stance. And, I've been involved in some of the approaches to some of the ministers to try and say, hang on, if we adopt protocols and we do this, that, and the other, at least domestic travel can be safe. You can have safe transport to a safe accommodation establishment. But we're finding that, and I suspect this is a little bit all over the continent, is we're also the bad baby, child, or whatever that brought this thing. Travel brought it. We were the naughty guys who brought it in. And amongst other things, this is a thing we're having to get around. And I think, the South African government's got a very detailed, what they call it, adjusted risk adjustment strategy. But I think they've approached it the wrong way. I think we should be really approaching, can you create the right social distancing, the right hygiene, the right sanitization to operate safely? Then you should be able to operate. And we have gone to government and said this in South Africa. We are hopeful that this will mean that compared to the levels that were announced, where we would only be operating in level 2 or level 1, which was going to be August, September, before there was even domestic tourism, that hopefully when level 3 gets finalized, which, by the way, our president announced last night would be coming around the 1st of June, there will be a little bit more freedom for travel and tourism, especially domestic. And then I will concur that the big opportunity, there is no big opportunity. Yep. One of the ways to soften the problem is to go for the domestic market. But remember that across the continent, domestically, we're going to be in a recessionary environment. Corporates and individuals will have discretionary income. So it's going to be a suppressed domestic market. The other one we can look at in South Africa, and there are nuggets of it, and I don't know the size of it on the rest of the continent, is, let's call it, to recapture the outbound market. We have an 83 billion rand per year outbound travel and tourism market of South Africans who leave the country. They will not all want to stay here, but some of that has to be possible to bring back in to plug the gap for now until international starts a little bit later, which we all recognize is probably going to be later. And then the one we need to about on our continent is what they're calling in other parts of the world bubbles or corridors. So they're saying, so the first people to talk like this was Australia and New Zealand. They said, hey, we've done this okay, we've got our curve flattened, we'll have reciprocal travel and tourism between the two countries. And then they said, hang on, if you look around the world, and they haven't done this, they've just talked about it, Canada also looks okay. We can actually open our borders with Canada. Canada will open. So I think we need to look at ourselves on the continent and create some of those regional corridors or bubbles, whatever they are. And we need to be very careful. I follow quite a lot of the leisure tourism side of the industry. Tanzania said today they're open for business for safari tourism for their international guests to come back. This was a bad thing, in my opinion, because if you actually look at Tanzania's approach to managing the crisis, it's one of the worst in the world. They actually sort of put forward as a very odd way, and they haven't managed it well. So that is going to land us in bad, with this smear of Africa doesn't know what they're doing, and Africa says can when they're not. And so we need to watch things like that as well. And that's where I think African associations should be talking with the African Union and others to say, there are ways that perhaps we should approach this as a continent, and we should start looking at where we can say safely we'll have intra-African tourism, again, like domestic tourism, always, I think, not really played as important a part or role as it could. And as we prove that operates safely, that's when you can bring the international travelers back into the countries.
Yeah, Mossadegh, to maybe kind of build on that point, I mean, from a West Africa point of view, I think definitely an area with huge domestic or regional travel potential, but a lot of that outbound travel obviously leaves the continent. What do you think the opportunity is there, and what can kind of really be done to promote interregional travel within West Africa, in the next 18 months?
Well, first, I would like to invite everyone to come to Bamako. The lockdown is not that severe as in South Africa.
I'm coming soon.
And I would like also to reflect on Luri's comments on financing. I think also this pandemic should be an opportunity for the finance industry, maybe to look at the way tourism industry, especially the hospitality industry, is financed. We all are aware that it's largely underfinanced, with some loans which have very short maturities, and we don't have a very specialized financing scheme like we have in Europe, where you have developers, their job is to develop. You have financiers who finance on a 15, 20, 25-year period, like the pension funds, the insurance companies. You have owners, you have brands like Erwan's brands, and even have third-party managers. So we really have a very structured industry in Europe, Asia, and America, which we don't have on the continent. I have been, for more than 25 years now, I have been a developer, an owner, a manager, a financier. I have been everything to develop Azalea Hotels Group. No wonder I have been able to develop only 10 properties in 25 years, because I'm doing everything. So maybe we should really take this opportunity to sit down. That may be the topic of our next Africa Hotel Investment Forum, how we can structure hospitality tourism development so that we have key players in each segment of the industry, so that I can be only a brand manager instead of being a financier and a developer. So maybe that's one of the takeaways of this pandemic. Coming back to your question, Wayne, well, as I said, for us in West Africa, domestic traveling is the biggest chunk of our revenues. So how to develop it? Once the frontiers, of course, the borders are open, is to have, and you said it in your introduction, we need a visa-free Africa. I saw on one of your slides, as an African, I need a visa to go to 49% of African countries, which is absolutely not normal. I have a Schengen visa. I can go to 27 countries in Europe with one Schengen visa. That's not normal. That's not normal. So that will really boost intra-Africa travels. We talked about, of course, air connection, air links, which is way expensive. It costs me as much to fly Bamako to Dakar as it will cost me to go to Paris, which is absolutely not normal. Of course, if I want to go to Joburg or Nairobi, it will take me one day. So this is also something we really we should look after and work on to develop early. Our industry cannot thrive, our industry cannot develop without a visa-free Africa, good airlines, and of course, we also have to train our human resources. You said in your introduction, I saw the slide. Tourism is really developing on the continent, no doubt about it, and it's attracting all the major players. But we don't see hospitality schools opening in most of our countries.
And I know you've been very much pushing that. I think with the partnership with EHL and
Absolutely.
Exactly.
We at Azalea, we opened 2 schools, one in Mali, one in Burkina Faso, and we are subsidizing with a percentage of our revenues. We are taking to subsidize these schools, and we are paying training fees to the governments, training taxes to the governments, but we are not getting back the training we are entitled to. So this is also something we should work on.
Yeah.
So if we have visa-free, good air connection, good roads also, because not every Africans can buy airline tickets. So if we have good roads, we can also have ground transportation, and that will boost our industry.
Yeah, agreed. And just coming to a couple questions from the floor, Luri, maybe I'll just try to combine two questions into one. I mean, do you think fundamentally the business model for hotels and maybe the owner-operator relationship is going to change? And how likely do you think new investment into Africa in the next 12 months is, and what is the type of investment that we're really going to see?
Yeah, I think good question. I think, look, there's always an opportunity for the owner-operator relationship to change. That's an ongoing tussle and has been since the big brands went asset light, and it's that kind of friction between owner-operators that when it works in harmony, it creates a lot of value, and when it doesn't, it becomes quite fractious and a massive distraction in your business. So look, I do think owners will use this opportunity to try and open up management agreements and get slightly better terms. I think a lot is going to depend on the requirements that come out on protocols, policies, and procedures, right? Because owners at this stage are holding their breath. They've got closed properties and they've got furloughed staff, and what they're seeing is massive expenses coming down the pike in terms of sanitizing rooms, putting up screens, PP&E for staff. In a recession with massive demand destruction, the last thing you need is an additional tax on your business, right? So I would expect owners to try and speak to operators about sharing that burden to a certain degree. What that'll look like is going to be on a case-by-case basis. From what I've seen, the brands have been quite flexible, especially around being able to access FF&E funds and getting a little bit more creative in terms of how they've looked at the relationship, given that this is such a symbiotic pairing. In terms of new investment on the continent, I don't. This is maybe a silver lining. I don't see new supply coming in. I think if you have a project on site at the moment, you'll do very well to finish that, given that your funders are probably very anxious and not and caught on this kind of uncertainty continuum that we've discussed, right? So I think, but if you can finish it, I think you and the rest of the market, wherever you are, will probably see some RevPAR improvements, based on supply adjusted forecasts, because supply is going to dry up. Right? This is the same as with the Great Recession financial crisis. There was no new supply in the majority of these of African countries for 2008, 9, 10, and sometimes into 11. So that helped a lot of the markets recover quicker. I do, so in terms of new developments, I can't see a lot of money going into that, and even if there was equity for that, I don't see bank debt being available. Acquisitions is definitely going to be something that'll come back, and I do actually think that brownfield repositionings will be something that gains traction. I think we all know about all the properties around the continent that are independent, they don't meet brand standard, but they are in incredible locations, and you can see the opportunity, right? A lot of these properties are owned by families or individuals for which hospitality is non-core to their business. So I think, number one, there's going to be an opportunity to have conversations with these people. Number two, again, hopefully you'll be able to get your brand or your operator to accept something that might be slightly different to their normal brand standard in terms of room sizes or key counts for certain brands. And I can see how people get creative with the minimal amount of capital around those kind of things, and building out the network. So It's going to vary, and I think the timing's going to vary because, again, we're talking of Africa as this homogenous whole. I think parts of Africa is going to come out of this. All the countries in Africa are already starting to diverge in terms of how they're treating this and how they're dealing with this. I think that's going to affect the timeline and the ETAs for normality or whatever normalcy looks like in the future. And because of these kind of differences in timeline, you're going to see different approaches to how people put capital to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gillian, maybe just to you from a MICE perspective, I mean, it's a question from the floor. Do we think, what is the future for a sector where we've all become very, I guess, accustomed to Zoom meetings, and do we still see it as a pillar for the sector?
I think it will come back as a pillar for the sector. I do think some of the corporates will adjust a little bit, and there'll be more Zoom type meetings and a little bit less meetings and a little bit less travel for meetings. But I think the big associations, the big events will still happen. I think we're seeing quite a few postponing. So some of those events only happen every 2 or 3 years, and they're saying, right, this one that was going to be in 2020 is cancelled. We'll go to our 2022 event, and they're expecting to carry on. I think the challenge is between when it comes back, which I do not think it's going to be the fastest, it's going to be one of the slowest, because doing your social distancing or physical distancing when you've got 2,000 people is going to be difficult. And you need double the room size, and you need like these massive lobby spaces where you can't network, because networking is what you came to do, but you can't talk to people. So I think there's going to be a challenge until this thing has worked its way fully out of the system, or more fully out of the system. I think there might be some opportunities to try and regionalize events. So you might have an event that would be one of the smaller global events, and it has 5 events, one in Europe, one in Africa somewhere, one in the US somewhere, and they do smaller groups. We tried to position this. I think a lot of countries started when we started seeing the clamping down. They started in nothing over 1,000, then nothing over 500, then nothing over 100, then nothing over 50, then nothing over 20, and then nothing over 5. Now we're probably going to ramp back up in the opposite direction, but we need to sort of talk sensibly to people, because to me it's not really about whether it's 50 people. It's about if the capacity is 100, then I can put 50 people in there. So we should be able to sort of have those conversations with the people who put whatever these protocols and rules are in place, and try and push as much of that side of the industry. And I think we've got to look to. I think we've always been in Africa, probably, we feel ourselves, it's like an inferiority complex. There is nothing wrong with African meetings, African events, African stuff for Africans on our continent. And Europe, if you look at Paris, it just came top of the ICA rankings for the most meetings, or the most ICA ranked meetings in a city. But a huge chunk of those meetings, predominantly most of the people at them are Europeans, and a lot of the meeting industry in Europe is Europeans. We need an African continental meetings industry, and this may be the opportunity to push that a little bit more and to get that going. But I'm going to go back to what Mossadegh said, if I may. I think it's easy to say we should get that happening. There's the intra-African travel as an opportunity. We do need to ease visas, and I think that's where this industry needs to also talk to the AU together. The AU actually says there's 2 things. They've got an Agenda 2063, which said the continent will be visa-free. And in fact, originally they wanted to be visa-free by the end of this decade, which is this year, or was last year, depending how you measure. But we need to get back onto that. And we need to get onto the agenda of visa-free continent. We also need to get on the, what's the SATM, the single air transport market, which we had very, very good progress on signatures to that market recently. And if we can get the continent to free up the airspace and go for the single air access market, and we can get visas out of the way in most cases, then we can do this fantastic Africa for Africans type of tourism and meetings and events industry.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Owen, from your side, there's 2 questions here. Your view on new projects in the pipeline that are maybe very early stage. So someone's looking to develop a hotel still, and they've only just really began that process. I mean, what do you think the kind of prospects are for that? I know it's very market specific, but just in general. And then also specifically around Radisson and your view from an extended stay perspective in Africa, so service departments. What do you think the prospects are for those in this post-COVID environment?
So to answer the first question with regards to the hoteling development and the pipeline that we have, of course it depends on it's pretty much market specific and depending on the local regulation. But most of the projects that have been committed by the owner and investor are still happening. There is obviously a delay in completion and materialization. It's what we're seeing overall as a picture is the hotel that were due to open this year, most of them postponed to early next year. And it's a reality on the ground because you have nations that are completely shut down where you cannot have construction company and different professionals coming on the ground. So we keep working on our pipeline remotely, and we are discovering the Zoom and the Teams of this world to communicate and to move forward the process. But the delay will be there for most cases. Now, we're talking about hotels that are already under development, active on the ground with already committed funding. So there is a delay because of the physical aspect of not being able to travel. Now, if we're talking about projects that are at the very early stage of feasibility study, and where there is no funding commitment, and the operator Radisson has not signed an international management agreement, meaning that we're really at the beginning of the process. Some of the projects are just gonna dry and disappear because of the situation of the owner or the promoter. 85% of our owners are first-time owners, meaning that they have a core business and they decided to diversify into hotel business. If the core business is not growing and is not flourishing, which can happen during this COVID-19, obviously it's going to dry out hotel project. This is where we're coming up with the fact that there is high probability that new supply are not going to go through in a lot of cases. Now,
sorry, continue.
With regards to extended stay, we've seen a high demand on this segment for a while, and we've decided to use our range of 5 brands dedicated to hotel, have an extension for extended stay or serviced apartments. So we have a lot of projects that are being developed because there is more and more demand for long-term guests that are again looking for safety and security. So our vision is that it's going to keep growing, obviously with the reality of the market that I just mentioned earlier, but it's definitely not something that is going to disappear on the continent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think just to the first question as a follow-up, it's something we're seeing globally now where a lot of investors, when they're comparing and buying an existing asset versus developing an asset, there's obviously that timeline before they can start to earn money on a new development, whereas we're actually seeing a lot of capital being attracted into developments that are 2 to 3 years out from opening because you've bridged that COVID period anyway. But whereas in a normal situation, your opportunity cost on acquiring an existing trading asset would be there, whereas now that's definitely been bridged, I guess. Maybe Luri, and I'll pose the question as well to Mossadegh. Just in terms of, I guess, transparency, the question is around Sub-Saharan Africa and reporting of COVID cases. Do you think it's going to be a significant problem in the months to come around people coming to Africa and then knowing that they're probably going to have to go into longer quarantine periods because of the lack of, I guess, transparency around cases? I think that's the extent of the question.
I think, and Gillian touched on this earlier, ultimately, if what's causing, if what the primary cause behind, this kind of conversation today and where we're sitting in today is uncertainty, then the flip side of that is trust, right?
Yep.
So people don't want to travel because they don't want to go to a restaurant because A, they're uncertain, and B, because they don't trust that they're not going to get sick. Right. So if this applies at a household level, this applies at a corporate level, this applies at a national government level. So if there are any questions about testing, whether that's the number of testing, whether that's the way it's testing, or how this is being reported in any government anywhere, people are going to step away, right? And this is not an absolute measure, this is a relative measure. So people are going to say, compared to where I am in the world today, this is how COVID's being tested, this is how it's being handled, and therefore, if I'm looking to go to country X, I don't think they're doing it quite as well, and therefore I'd rather not go there, right? And this is going to be, again, this is going to be at the level of an individual traveler. This is going to be at a corporate level within the hospitality industry. And this is going to be between governments saying, and back to Gillian's point earlier about these islands or these corridors, right? I don't trust you, government on that side of the world, to not send sick people to my country where I've just spent an entire a truckload of money trying to make sure that I no longer have a COVID problem. So yes, I think the answer is yes. I think it's the more transparency, the better, and because again, I think that's the starting point is you have to build trust. There's going to be an element of marketing in this, right? And you can see some of the Middle Eastern countries already marketing themselves, saying how much are we testing, how well are we doing testing. South Africa is doing something, I think, almost unique and incredibly smart in the way that they're doing the community testing. I don't think South Africa is patting itself on the back enough for that, because I think the quality of data that South African government is getting is vastly superior to a lot of European countries that are still only testing cases that report to hospitals, right? So who communicates this? Again, South Africa's got a body that speaks to government, and maybe they can take these messages and start pushing it out into the world. I think the continent has historically been underserved on that basis, and I think a lot of thought needs to go into who communicates the messages from the hospitality and tourism industry on the continent, and maybe this is the crisis that we need to kickstart those conversations.
Mossadegh, do you have a view on the topic?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Here, Wayne, we really need a continent-wide collaboration. If not, it will be very difficult to navigate through 54 rules. That will be almost impossible. So I think AU has a key role to play in that matter, so that we can have common rules, at least some basic rules, which will apply continent-wide. Because I saw some news, I don't know which country, which opened the airspace. You can fly to that country, but when you come, you are quarantined for 14 days. I mean, if you are a business traveler, you just have 48 hours to take care of your business. How in the world are you going to be quarantined for 14 days? I mean, for me, it doesn't make any sense. So maybe AU has a key role to play. World Health Organization has a key role to play. But I totally agree. I'm quite confident and positive that our industry will pick up again, because nothing can replace a face-to-face meeting. As Gillian said, yes, some business will still remain on webinars, Zoom, and all these platforms. But in the long run, people will come back. They will change their travel patterns. And we saw it in West Africa when we had the Ebola crisis, when we had the terrorist crisis. Especially business travelers did continue to travel, but they changed their travel patterns. Maybe they will stay less longer, and they had some new patterns. And as hoteliers, we adapted to these new patterns. So totally agree. We need common ground rules for the whole continent. The governments need to sit down and talk and see how we can open up again the frontiers, the airspace, and have some common rules so that our business can pick up again. Of course, as hoteliers, we also have to adapt new protocols, as everyone said. Maybe we can also harmonize the protocols so that the customers will not get lost. Will say, why do I have this at Radisson? I don't have it as a Live or Accor. So maybe we can also have some protocol for the whole hospitality industry. If we do that at the government level, at the hospitality level, maybe we can get some confidence from the customers, and they will start traveling again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we're going to start wrapping up and I'd just like to get everyone's kind of final view on outlook and, what are the key things that you're watching in the next few months around recovery? I mean, what are the things that the audience should really be kind of paying close attention to as this evolves, really? Owen, maybe let's start with you.
Can you repeat the question, please?
I think just your view on outlook and, what are the key things that you're looking to in terms of tracking that recovery? I mean, what is your view on the outlook longer term and shorter term?
On the shorter term, I think that we have very uncertainty and we are surfing on the wave of governmental action. So it's very country specific of what we can do and how the recovery is going to happen. On the longer term, as we all said by all colleagues, I mean, the fundamentals of Africa remains the same. I think I remain quite positive that it's going to bounce back. We've seen in China, there is a strong recovery happening. Of course, China is relying on domestic travel. So obviously, domestic travel will be the first one to allow our country to recover its tourism, and it will be much more difficult for countries relying on the international leisure travel, as we mentioned earlier. But overall, I'm positive that this global crisis will make us stronger and hopefully wiser.
Gillian, your thoughts?
Yeah, key things to watch. I think we are both lucky and unlucky, but I think we're going to be able to watch. We already are watching what's happening in China. We're going to see what happens in Europe now as there's some easing off. I think there's a lot of challenges like Mossadegh mentioned about quarantine, for instance. This is a notion that it's just anathema to travel. How can everybody have to go sit in 14 days somewhere when they arrive and then 14 days somewhere else when they get back to where they came from? It's just nuts. So what we need to also watch very carefully, and I think, whatever happens, I don't think we're going to see much of the international leisure market till next year. International business and related travel will be picking up hopefully a little bit towards the end of this year. Yeah. But things will come. Vaccines will come. Quick testing will come, and immunity testing will come. So there's things that we'll be able to use as tools within our industry to sort of not have quarantine, to tell everybody that all our hotel workers are tested weekly, or 90% of our hotel workers have already got immunity because we've tested them for the immunity. There's things that will help us as we get further down the road, and we need to watch those things and see what goes on there. I think you used the word trust there, Rory, and I think that's vital. And I think Africa is often, it's like when you have a terrorist event in Africa, the attitude is very different to a terrorist event in London because we're Africa. Yeah. And the same goes with disease. And the same goes that South Africa, we can, and I think we should subtly say, hang on, we've done a very, very good job of managing this disease at this point. Long may that continue, but we have. But I mean, it's getting that message out cleverly and it's actually making it true, because I don't think it's 100% true across the continent either. And so that we have to manage. And then we get to the final thing that Mossadegh said is, how do we do that? It's doing it with the AU. Now, the AU is whatever, I forget how many governments, 57 governments talking together, and it's been an uphill battle to get things through there. They say a lot of the right things, but they don't often do them. What I really would hope is that this crisis has given the impetus to the individual governments and to the industries in the country to say, you have to do it now. There is no waiting from Yamoussoukro when we first signed Yamoussoukro, how many, 20 years ago. This is it. It's like do or die. We have to do these things now. and hopefully we can get that message over. So I don't want to be a dampener, but I'm just going to say our own Ministry of Tourism here, we've been talking to the Minister of Tourism. She's been supporting the industry and saying, I understand that I think we can ease restrictions and we can operate earlier according to the levels. But I've just been sent a photo of a new, a massive sort of drop-down banner that's gone on the side of the Department of Tourism in Pretoria. And the banner says, stop traveling, stop the spread. So it's like the opposite. Government tends to be like very hawkish, as I'm using that word. It's, I don't know. That's what we have to do. We have to build an image of Africa as a place where it's going to be safe to travel to, and we have to get ourselves to work as a continent. Some of the key things we need, which will free us up both to receive the international tourists as well as enable our own markets to travel.
Yeah, exactly. And Mossadegh, your final thoughts?
Look, when it's tough, it's a very difficult moment. It's really tough on our industry, especially on our associates who are sitting home, who have the revenue. But I'm also confident. I'm positive. I think we'll come out of this crisis strong. We have learned a lot, and we need governments now to do their job. We are doing our job. We are getting ready to reopen, but definitely there are rules that the governments have to imagine: air traffic, frontier control, sanitization protocols, all this stuff. We cannot do it by ourselves. So we need now EU governments plus the industries to get together and reopen our business. But I'm confident. Again, I think nothing can replace a meeting face to face, and people will start traveling again, and they will maybe change their travel patterns, but they will start traveling again. So the industry will survive.
Yeah, certainly, and I certainly look forward to coming and visiting you up in Bamako soon, hopefully. Laurie and yourself, in just terms of final thoughts before we close.
Yeah, well, firstly, I think in terms of kind of lead indicators, I'm paying very close attention to connectivity. Like I said, for me, that's a proxy of trust between countries, and people want to travel, they want to get out of this, they want to go on holiday. It's a big step forward in restoring their trust if their government says it's okay, you can now travel to that country, right? It's kind of the due diligence is being done for them. So connectivity is going to be something that I'm spending a lot of time on. I think the macro picture, because again, we are in a recession. It's probably global, and how quickly different countries come out of that is going to affect trading at hotels, and more immediately, how quickly some of these hotels actually even open up, right? And that's also going to be driving some of the opportunities we'll see down the line. So those are the things I'm spending a fair bit of time on and watching closely. But in terms of parting thoughts, I think tough times ahead. But there's going to be massive opportunity, right? And for people looking to whether it's deploying capital, driving efficiencies in their business, or could we hope for coordination at a nation, at government level within Africa to start promoting tourism, to put it in its rightful place? There's opportunity will abound, and we need to be ready for it.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great sort of parting note is that opportunity, we all do what we do because we believe in that opportunity, and I think that the fundamentals of that are still incredibly good, and we're still very early stages in the life cycle and the evolution of the hotel industry in Africa, and I think we've just really got some tough times ahead, and to Mossadegh's point, it's our associates and employees that are really the ones that we need to look after through this time. So I think thank you everyone for joining me, and I'm going to hand over back to Kafir for his parting thoughts.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you to the panel. I thought that was a great session. Obviously, and once again, thanks to the audience for tuning in, and to our sponsors. And we'll be having 2 sessions, one focused on the SADC, one focused on West Africa. So tune in for those, and have a great day. Thank you, everyone, and thank you once again to the panelists and to Wayne. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Wayne. Very much. Good. Thanks. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.